The most brutal female criminals in medieval and Renaissance history. Hey guys! Tonight we're drifting into a corner of history that somehow manages to be both very quiet and absolutely chaotic. A place where noblewomen, princesses, widows, and occasionally that one eccentric neighbor with too many cats managed to commit crimes so messy that chroniclers had to rewrite the events 3 times just to make them sound respectable. So, get comfortable. Pull your blanket up. Let your eyelids do that slow, sleepy thing they do. Because tonight, we're floating gently, and I do mean gently, through the lives of medieval and Renaissance women who turned crime into a personality trait, all while keeping the details soft enough to stay YouTube-friendly. And since these women lived before the invention of psychological analysis, police files, or even the concept of, maybe we should not let her run an entire castle unsupervised, most of what we know comes from gossiping monks, concerned neighbors, and court scribes who were definitely underpaid. So, let's begin with someone who makes modern true crime documentaries look like bedtime nursery rhymes. Lady Giovanna of Naples, the queen who made drama part of government. Let's float to 14th century Naples. Warm streets, orange trees, and a royal court with enough interpersonal drama to fuel 8 seasons of historical television. At the center of it all, Queen Giovanna I. A woman with a crown, influence, ambition, and apparently the medieval equivalent of a very chaotic energy drink. Giovanna had the misfortune, or the reputation, depending on who you asked, of being constantly surrounded by people who mysteriously stopped being alive. Chroniclers wrote things like, "Her enemies fell away. Those who opposed her did not persist long." And my personal favorite, her rivals met unfortunate conclusions. Unfortunate conclusions is such a lovely, vague medieval way of saying, well, something happened, but we're not writing the details because we enjoy having jobs. Now, was she personally involved? Maybe. Maybe not. Historians still debate her level of participation. But what's certain is that she was at the center of so many court scandals, accusations, and political disappearances that even the Pope had to step in at one point and say something like, "Hey! Could you maybe calm down a little?" Giovanna's reign was a long, sleepy river of political alliances, royal marriages, and nobles politely vanishing whenever they irritated her supporters. And through it all, she maintained a serene queenly aura, as if nothing unusual was happening in her kingdom whatsoever. A true medieval multitasker. Running a kingdom while also being the main character in every possible scandal. Let's gently drift forward. Isabella of France, the sweet-faced queen with a sharp political edge. Now sliding calmly into early 14th century England. Here we meet Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, a king with, let's call it, creative decision-making skills. Isabella was nicknamed the She-Wolf, which is a little dramatic for someone whose biggest crime was realizing her husband was a bit of a disaster and choosing to solve the problem herself. Her version of problem-solving included forming alliances, gathering armies, and encouraging certain important people to quietly retire from life. All done very gracefully, I should add. Isabella never acted with rage or chaos. According to chroniclers, she had perfect posture, perfect outfits, and perfect timing, even when inconvenient individuals suddenly stopped appearing at court functions. She managed to orchestrate a full governmental takeover while staying so calm about it that even her enemies admitted she had style. Did she eliminate obstacles? Probably. Did she do it personally? Probably not. Did medieval writers heavily imply things without saying them? Absolutely. She's one of those women whose crimes were never described, only suggested. You know it's serious when monks start writing sentences with 6 layers of indirect blame. Let's drift on. Countess Elisabeth of Central Europe, yes, that one, calm version. You've probably heard her modern nickname. But don't worry, we're not doing that version tonight. We're doing the gentle YouTube bedtime version of Countess Elisabeth Bathory. She was a noblewoman in 16th century Hungary, extremely wealthy, extremely privileged, and so removed from reality that she probably thought peasants reproduced by photosynthesis. Now, the legends about her are very dramatic, far too dramatic for our low-energy nighttime stroll. So we're focusing on what historians widely agree on. She was harsh. Severely harsh. Unreasonably harsh. And treated her household staff with a level of discipline that was, in the softest possible terms, not great. Servants in her castle frequently disappeared or suffered punishments not consistent with good governance, according to the polite wording of her trial records. The nobility covered it up for years, because that's what nobility did. But eventually, people noticed a pattern, and the crown intervened. After a lengthy legal process, she was placed under house arrest, the medieval version of, let's politely avoid public scandal and pretend everything is fine. Even though stories about her became wildly exaggerated later, the real historical woman was already concerning enough without any horror additions. Alright. Let's glide away slowly before folklore starts trying to join the conversation. Beatrice di Tenda, the duchess who became a political convenience. Moving over to 15th century Milan, we meet Beatrice di Tenda, a wealthy widow who married the duke and then, unfortunately, became more influential than he was comfortable with. Beatrice wasn't criminal in the usual sense. Her case is almost the reverse, she was accused of wrongdoing so her husband could remove her, politically speaking. But medieval courts being what they were, the line between real criminals and convenient accusations was thin enough to fall through. Her enemies claimed she conspired, misbehaved morally, and undermined the duke's authority. None of which the chroniclers bothered to detail, because apparently medieval writers loved writing accusations but hated explaining them. Beatrice maintained her innocence calmly until the end. Her trial was vague, sleepy, full of whispered gossip and political maneuvering, basically a Renaissance group project where nobody wanted to take responsibility. Her story shows a darker side of the era. Sometimes, criminal women weren't criminals at all. They were simply in the way. Let's drift softly onward before Italian politics start getting loud. Leonarda of Italy, the Renaissance widow with too many solutions. Now we float into early 17th century Italy, just barely past the medieval period but close enough in vibe that nobody will complain if we include it. Leonarda Cianciulli owned a soap shop, baked pastries, and had an optimistic belief that she could control fate through creative methods. Not graphic ones, just unconventional ones. Her crimes are usually described with far too much enthusiasm in true crime retellings. Tonight we're doing the cozy blanket version. Leonarda firmly believed in superstition, fortune-telling, and the idea that destiny could be bent if you removed certain people from your personal orbit. Quietly. And extremely thoroughly. Court records describe her actions with gentle understatement, noting that she handled certain acquaintances with finality. A phrase that really makes you appreciate how hard scribes work to stay polite. She eventually confessed, very calmly, and accepted her sentence with a level of composure that suggests she truly thought she was doing the right thing the entire time. Ah, Renaissance optimism. Let's float on before Italian witch trial energy begins gathering around us. And with that, our river of quiet chaos begins. Each of these women operated in societies where information traveled slowly. Justice was uneven. Nobles had limitless protection. And crime records were basically handwritten opinion pieces. Which is why their crimes look very different from modern ones. They weren't sensational. They weren't frantic. They weren't cinematic. They were quiet. Calm. Socially strategic. And mostly committed in dim stone halls where everyone was too polite, or too afraid, to speak their mind, where quiet villainy meets courtly manners. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here, drifting comfortably under your blanket with that slow, pleasant heaviness behind your eyes, perfect. Tonight we keep gliding through the medieval and Renaissance world, a world where the architecture was sharp, the fashion was complicated, and certain women discovered that crime was surprisingly manageable if everyone around you was too polite to question anything. So let's settle back into that calm, slow, late-night tone. And drift toward another set of women whose reputations are still floating around in dusty archives, usually accompanied by phrases like inconvenient, troublesome, or unfortunately assertive. We'll continue keeping everything gentle, soft, and vague, the bedtime version of crime history. Elfrith of England, the medieval stepmother energy was strong. Let's quietly drift to 10th century England, a place full of fog, church bells, and earls who argued about everything except their actual responsibilities. Here we meet Elfrith, queen consort and later queen mother. Depending on which chronicler you ask, she was either a respected royal matriarch, or the medieval blueprint for every wicked stepmother character ever written. Chroniclers were not subtle. They wrote with the kind of poetic drama you only get from monks who clearly needed more hobbies. The main accusation against her is tied to the unfortunate end of her stepson, King Edward, who met with what the historical record gently calls an abrupt and sorrowful conclusion during a visit to her estate. Monks wrote things like, "Events occurred in shadow. His passing was not aligned with peaceful intentions. The Queen's presence was notable." Which is medieval paperwork language for, "We're implying something, but please don't ask us for details." Did Elfrith orchestrate anything? Nobody can say with certainty. But she benefited politically, and medieval politics had all the subtlety of a boot to the head. She went on to manage the kingdom smoothly as the new king's mother, calm, poised, and absolutely unbothered by the centuries of gossip she would inspire. Let's quietly glide away before angry Anglo-Saxon ghosts start forming a queue. Catherine de Medici, the queen who turned political strategy into a lifestyle. Now we gently drift into 16th century France, specifically the glowing, gilded rooms of Catherine de Medici, queen, regent, and full-time mother to 10 children, half of whom were future monarchs and all of whom were dramatic. Catherine is one of those historical women where the gossip far exceeds the facts, mostly because she had a foreign accent, an interest in astrology, and the impossible job of running France during a religious civil war. In early modern Europe, that was enough to make her the designated villain of every story for the next 400 years. Catherine's alleged crimes come in a buffet-style assortment, usually served with phrases like, "She arranged matters with quiet efficiency. Opponents disappeared under unclear circumstances. The Queen Mother exerted influence from behind tapestries." Which is a very polite way of saying she knew how to remove obstacles without creating loud noise about it. Did she personally commit crimes? Probably not. Did she encourage policies that ended poorly for many people? Almost certainly. Did the chroniclers describe her with the energy of someone writing an anonymous complaint letter? Absolutely. But in all fairness, Catherine spent her entire life reacting to situations created by men who handled power about as gracefully as a toddler handles spaghetti. Let's drift onward before the French wars of religion decide to get dramatic. Margaret of Burgundy, the Duchess with the medieval, nope attitude. Floating now into the Low Countries, we meet Margaret of Burgundy, a woman who took political strategy so seriously that she practically turned calm ruthlessness into an aesthetic. Her marriage to Duke John the Fearless, yes, that was his real title, was complicated. And by complicated, I mean they spent most of their marriage plotting around one another with the energy of two cats pretending not to fight. Margaret's alleged involvement in political purges was always described in very soft, vague terms, such as, "The Duchess offered counsel at decisive moments. Her advice led to firm outcomes. Certain rivals found themselves removed from the playing field." The chroniclers were too terrified of her political network to say anything more specific. Margaret wasn't known for outbursts or drama. Instead, she had that serene, stoic composure that made everyone else nervous. You know someone is powerful when monks start describing them using weather metaphors. Let's glide away before the Burgundian court decides to host a midnight political coup. Maria of Aragon, the queen who used quiet influence like a scalpel. Now slipping into Spain, early Renaissance Spain, calm, dusty, and full of aristocrats who took family honor extremely seriously. Maria of Aragon, queen consort of Portugal, had a public image that was the medieval equivalent of a perfectly polished glass window. She prayed often. She dressed modestly. She spoke softly. And she allegedly made problems solve themselves with a level of subtlety that would impress a shadow. Reports from the period refer to her involvement in correcting rival factions, adjusting the political landscape, and ensuring that inconvenient persons withdrew from influence. All very tidy. All very polite. All extremely vague. Maria's greatest crime, according to the records, was being better at political maneuvering than half the men around her, which in the Renaissance was practically a punishable offense. Let's drift on before Iberian politics start clanking their armor at us. Bianca Maria Visconti, the Duchess with a steel-lined smile. Floating back to northern Italy, where every noble family seemed to keep a grudge list as long as a city map, we meet Bianca Maria Visconti, Duchess of Milan. Bianca Maria was raised in a household where solving disputes quietly and efficiently was considered a form of etiquette. Chroniclers described her as calm, impressive, blessed with a resolute nature, and capable of decisive arrangements. Decisive arrangements, of course, is Renaissance historian code for she handled things. Her court records mention several political opponents who did not continue to hinder her ambitions. Which is a poetic way of implying that Bianca Maria used her influence to ensure her family maintained power, without ever being tied directly to anything questionable. Her specialty was diplomacy with a sprinkling of quiet force, the Renaissance equivalent of a velvet glove with steel stitching. Let's drift on, past the marble courtyards and suspiciously quiet council chambers. Agnes Bernauer, the woman too beautiful for the Duke's comfort. Now we gently drift into early 15th century Bavaria. Agnes Bernauer wasn't a noblewoman. She wasn't educated in court politics. She didn't orchestrate schemes. Her crime was simply existing, and being inconveniently charming. Agnes fell in love with Duke Albrecht's son, and the relationship became serious enough that Albrecht decided something needed to be resolved. Her beauty, influence, and growing popularity among the people were perceived as dangerous. So the Bavarian court accused her of the ever-popular medieval charge. Witchcraft. Not the sparkly fantasy kind. Just the standard, we need a legal excuse to remove someone, variety. Agnes was quietly condemned, quietly erased from the political scene, and quietly turned into a warning tale for centuries. She wasn't a criminal at all. But her story fits our theme because medieval Europe often created female criminals, where there were none, especially when politics or jealousy were involved. Let's drift away from this one softly. It's a quiet sorrow woven into the medieval landscape. And so our river of quiet crime flows on. In every corner of medieval and Renaissance Europe, women navigated systems that restricted their rights, limited their choices, and judged them more harshly than men. Some adapted by becoming gentle power brokers. Some resorted to political pressure, persuasion, or carefully arranged disappearances. And others were simply labeled criminals, because they stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. Continued. The first missing persons cases. That weren't called that yet. One thing that's strangely soothing about ancient history is how little paperwork people had to deal with. Of course, the downside was, well, if you disappeared, nobody filled out a missing person report. There was no, "Have you seen this person?" clay tablet posted on the city wall. People just kind of shrugged and said, maybe they wandered off, and life moved on. Which is exactly why ancient serial killers were able to slip through life with the ease of someone strolling through a marketplace, occasionally picking out a new victim like they were selecting figs. In most civilizations, if someone went missing, the assumptions were simple. They were eaten by an animal. They left voluntarily. The gods punished them. Oh well. And that strange little shrug from society allowed certain people who would have made modern forensic detectives go gray within a week, to thrive in total secrecy. Take ancient China, for example. The early dynasties were huge on bureaucracy, but human life wasn't exactly tracked like census records today. The government loved counting grain, counting weapons, counting horses, but people? They came and went. Which meant if your neighbors suddenly became extremely quiet lately, nobody asked questions. Even more interesting. Ancient records often describe evil spirits roaming an area when in reality, modern historians suspect these spirits might have been actual humans doing very non-spiritual, very unpleasant things. But what could an ancient serial killer even do with so little technology? Well, turns out the lack of technology was a blessing for them. No fingerprints. No DNA. No CCTV. No nosy true crime podcasters. Just endless cover provided by superstition. That brings us to one of the strangest types of ancient killers. The wandering healer who somehow made everyone worse. Before modern medicine, healers traveled from village to village. Most of them were well-meaning herbalists. Some were frauds. But a tiny fraction. Let's just say they enjoyed experimenting far more than healing. Picture a guy walking into a village with a pouch of herbs, a stick, and way too much confidence. He'd say he could cure headaches, fevers, curses, and maybe marital problems if he was having a particularly ambitious day. And nobody could fact-check him. But sometimes, people just didn't wake up. And the healer would shrug, pack his herbs, and leave. No accusations. No investigation. Just a quiet note in the village gossip. Well, guess the spirits didn't like that one. Historians now believe some of these wandering healers weren't simply bad at their jobs, they were deliberately trying things. Testing mixtures. Pushing boundaries. Using the lack of medical knowledge as the perfect smokescreen. No one thought of them as killers. Just unlucky physicians. Which is somehow more chilling. The ancient world's most dangerous camouflage, normalcy. One of the biggest misunderstandings about history is this idea that times were harder back then, so people were tougher. No. People were still very normal. They still trusted too easily. They still assumed the best. Meaning if someone looked like a well-behaved citizen, wore clean clothes, spoke politely, and didn't drool in public, society immediately accepted them. A killer who blended in during ancient times had 1,000 advantages. No profile sketches. No wanted posters. No databases. No detectives. No newspapers. No gossip-driven social media feeds. And zero systems to connect patterns. So if 3 people disappeared from village A and 4 disappeared from village B, nobody knew it might be the same person. The villages were days apart. News traveled slower than a bored donkey. This is why ancient serial killers weren't legendary villains. They were shadows with names nobody remembered. Except one, the quiet killer of ancient Egypt. The case that shouldn't exist. But somehow does. Now, ancient Egypt is famous for a lot of things. Pyramids, pharaohs, eyeliner so sharp it should count as a weapon. But one thing ancient Egypt was not famous for. Recorded crime investigations. They documented taxes. They documented harvests. They documented the number of donkeys someone owned. Yes, really. Egyptians loved administrative details. But murders? Disappearances? Those rarely made it onto papyrus, unless it involved a high-status person. Which is why an unusual set of records discovered in the 19th century left historians blinking at the translation like, wait. This looks suspiciously like the oldest serial killer file we've ever seen. The story comes from a series of complaint letters and temple reports found near Deir el-Medina, a community of artisans, the people who carved the royal tombs. This village was special. Everyone was literate. Everyone lived close together. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Basically, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a tiny neighborhood where everyone gossips. So when people began falling ill, disappearing, or dying under odd circumstances, people noticed. Quietly. Subtly. Nervously. Not because they suspected a murderer. But because they thought a curse was spreading. In ancient Egypt, everything unexplained was a curse. Someone sneezes twice. Curse. Goats stop producing milk. Curse. Your neighbor's house is strangely quiet at night. Definitely curse. But one man in the village, let's call him Nebet, since his real name is unclear, started showing up in these complaint letters a little too often. Not directly. Not like, "Dear scribe, Nebet is killing people." No, the ancient Egyptians would never be that straightforward. Instead, his name always appeared in the background. Nebet assisted with the burial. Nebet was the last to see the man at work. Nebet delivered the herbs for the fever. Nebet helped wash the linens of the deceased. It's the historical equivalent of a character in a film who keeps walking into scenes and you're like, "Why are you always here?" Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But constant. The temple priests grew suspicious, not because they thought Nebet was violent, but because they wondered if he was somehow spiritually contaminated. In their worldview, that was the only logical explanation. But then something strange happened. A priest wrote in one document. He comforts the grieving too quickly. And that is the moment modern historians collectively raised an eyebrow. Because if you've watched any true crime documentary ever made, you know that serial offenders often insert themselves into funerals, vigils, or investigations. And this was 3,200 years ago. Egyptians didn't even have a word for this behavior. But they definitely noticed it. The first profile, accidentally created. The priests began tracking Nebet, not as a suspect, but as a potential source of spiritual imbalance. They wrote notes such as, "He visits the homes of the afflicted before the sickness spreads. He knows the location of the bodies before they are found. He says he dreams of their deaths." Now, in fairness, Egyptians believed dreams were messages from gods or the dead. But if someone today told you, "Yeah, I had a dream your cousin died. And then the cousin did die," you're calling the police. And possibly moving. Because ancient priests didn't have police, they instead kept writing notes. Eventually, a senior scribe wrote, "Where Nebet visits, misfortune follows." This is, accidentally, the earliest written version of a criminal profile. They weren't thinking, "He's harming people." They were thinking, "He might be cursed, carrying bad energy." Which is, technically not wrong, depending on how you define bad energy. Eventually, Nebet was quietly removed from certain community duties, particularly those involving the sick or vulnerable. The record simply stopped mentioning him. No trial. No charges. No confrontation. He didn't vanish, he just faded out of the documents. And because the priestly notes end around that time, the curse mysteriously stopped. Nothing supernatural. Just the absence of one very concerning man. And so Nebet's story became the first ghostly outline of a serial killer in history, one who slipped through time because nobody had the language to name him. But that was Egypt. Now we travel to a place far more chaotic. A place where crime didn't hide in the shadows. It walked proudly in the sun.